Some things aren't supposed to be seen. Some documents aren't meant to be read. And sometimes when you catch a glimpse of what lies beneath the polished surface of power and celebrity, you wish you could forget it forever. I thought I was just following a story, chasing rumors. But the night I laid eyes on Tom Cruise's Scientology contract and realized what it was written with, my life stopped being my own. Grace didn't look like someone who belonged to a conspiracy. She was ordinary in every sense of the word. Hair tied back, secondhand jacket too thin for the weather, eyes darting like a rabbit waiting for the hawk. But what she carried, what she described, was anything but ordinary. She wasn't some journalist trying to sell a scoop. She wasn't a fan chasing attention. She was a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in days, clutching her bag as if it contained the last piece of her sanity. Her job on the yacht had always been routine. She set out trays, poured drinks, cleared glasses, smiled politely. The stars of the night barely noticed her. She told me she used to find comfort in that invisibility. Being staff meant you were background noise, too unimportant to matter. But the night that everything shifted, she realized that being invisible didn't make you safe. It made you a perfect witness. The evening had started like hundreds of others. The yacht bobbed gently in the water, its lights casting a halo on the waves. Celebrities stumbled aboard in glittering clothes. Music pulsed from hidden speakers and laughter spilled into the night. But as the hours crawled on, something in the air changed. She noticed it first when the music slowed, not stopped, not skipped, just slowed, like a tape reel dragging against its wheels. The laughter around her no longer sounded carefree. It sounded rehearsed, forced, like everyone was trying to cover up something deeper beneath their voices. She carried empty glasses back toward the lower deck when she saw them. Guests funneling quietly into a private room at the back of the yacht. It wasn't unusual for VIPs to want privacy, but she swore the air grew heavier the moment that door opened. She said it felt like stepping into a cathedral where the prayers had been replaced with something unspoken. Inside, she expected to find poker tables, hushed conversations, maybe a fight over money. Instead, she saw a desk. Just one desk, old and scarred, sitting in the center of the room. On top of it were papers. Not contracts typed on crisp white sheets, but yellowed pages marked with curling, jagged symbols she couldn't read. Each guest approached one by one, their faces strangely calm, almost reverent. A small cut, a drop of blood, and their names were added. No hesitation, no questions. Grace told me the silence was worse than the act itself. No one gasped, no one laughed. They just signed, stepped aside, and waited. When she described their eyes afterward, her voice dropped low, trembling. She said they looked emptied out, as if something behind them had been replaced. A few smiled too wide, their teeth clenched like they were holding back screams. She didn't belong in that room. She knew it. But her curiosity had rooted her in place until one man turned, his face still wet from where his blood had smeared across the paper. He smiled at her. Not the kind of smile you give a stranger on the street, but the kind that says, "We see you now." She fled, but even as she scrambled up the steps, she felt the weight of unseen eyes following her. It was after that night that the punishments began. Not immediately. At first, it was the kind of paranoia you could excuse. Her phone freezing, strange shadows in her apartment, co-workers turning cold. But then came the approach. One of the host's sons tracked her down weeks later, finding her in a public space, his voice calm and careful, urging her to sign an NDA. It sounded harmless, but she swore the paper he slid across the table felt exactly like the ones on the yacht. She refused, and that's when the hum began. She described it not as music, not even as sound, but as vibration. Something that lived under her skin. It showed up in quiet moments, alone in her car, washing dishes, falling asleep. And always beneath the noise, there was a word. It didn't scream, it didn't beg. It only whispered, patient and unrelenting. Sign. When she placed the stolen contract on my desk, my office seemed to shrink around us. The symbols weren't just marks. They moved if you looked too long, twisting like worms in the dirt, slipping from comprehension the moment your eyes adjusted. The air felt heavier, almost damp, as if the paper itself breathed. And at the bottom, that streak. Dried, dark, unmistakable. She didn't need to tell me what it was written with. My stomach already knew. I asked her why she risked taking it. She said she couldn't explain it, only that when she reached for the page, it felt like her choice wasn't her own, like the paper wanted to leave with her. She said that others didn't even notice, or maybe they did and simply let her take it. She looked at me then, her eyes brimming with something between desperation and resignation. "They're not protecting money," she whispered. "They're protecting him, the one they call to." The rain hit the window harder at that moment, as if the world itself wanted to drown out her words. I should have ended it there, handed the paper back, walked her to the door, and forgotten she ever came. But the truth is, part of me was already pulled in. And once you hear the first whisper, it's impossible to unhear it. Grace's testimony left me shaken, but one witness wasn't enough. Stories like hers needed a second thread, a second voice to anchor them. That's when I heard about Ellis, a photographer who had been hired to capture one of those infamous yacht nights. According to Grace, he was there with a camera around his neck when the first papers were signed. She claimed he'd never worked again after that night. Tracking him down wasn't difficult. He hadn't left his apartment in weeks. Neighbors whispered about the noises, screams at night, arguments with someone who wasn't there, the sound of furniture being dragged at 3 a.m. When I finally knocked on his door, it took him minutes to answer. And when he did, the man in front of me looked less like a photographer and more like a survivor of a fire that no one else could see. His eyes were bloodshot, darting left and right as though he expected something to follow me inside. He smelled of stale liquor and burned film chemicals. At first, he tried to shut the door, mumbling that he couldn't talk about that night. But when I said I wasn't there to judge, but to listen, he hesitated. Then, with the weariness of a man who'd carried too much too long, he stepped aside and let me in. The apartment was chaos. Photo prints scattered across the floor, crumpled like discarded drafts. Bottles tipped over, leaving rings on the stacks of newspapers. The blinds were drawn tight, duct taped shut, as if daylight itself wasn't safe. When I asked about the party, Ellis didn't speak right away. He just shuffled to a corner, dug through a pile of torn folders, and pulled out a stack of photographs. He handed them to me without a word. At first glance, they looked ordinary. Celebrities mid-laughter, glasses raised, lights glittering off the water. But the longer I studied them, the less normal they seemed. There were details the lens hadn't meant to catch. Stains on the floor, dark and uneven, too thick to be wine. Symbols smeared across the walls, jagged strokes that seemed to glow under the flash. Eyes that didn't quite align with smiles. Faces too stretched, too empty. And then there was the last photo. It stopped me cold. Diddy stood behind a desk on the yacht, his hand hovering above a single sheet of paper. The photo blurred at the edges as though the camera itself recoiled. But at the center, clear as day, was that page, the same curling, impossible sigils, a streak across the bottom like the one Grace had shown me. Ellis's hands trembled as he watched me flip through the stack. His voice was almost a whisper when he finally spoke. "That's the contract. I saw him sign it. I saw them all sign it." He swallowed hard. They changed after. Their bodies didn't, not exactly, but their faces, their movements. It wasn't them anymore. Something else was moving inside them. I asked him what he meant, but he only shook his head and pointed toward the darkest corner of his apartment. "They're still here," he muttered. "The shadows. Watching. Waiting." Later that night, I understood what he meant. I'd taken the photographs home with me, spread them across my desk for closer study. As I stared at the blurred faces, a sound began. Soft at first, a vibration more than a melody. It reminded me of a dozen instruments all tuning at once, none in harmony, yet strangely hypnotic. I tried to drown it out with television, with music, with anything. But it seeped through, weaving itself into every noise. The shadows in my apartment lengthened. Corners that had been harmless an hour before now stretched deep, like doorways into another place. I turned off the lights, convinced it was just exhaustion. But in the dark, I saw it. Movement, subtle but unmistakable. Something leaned, something shifted. I don't know how long I sat frozen, staring at those shapes. By the time I turned the lights back on, the photographs were gone. Every one of them. The only thing left on my desk was the paper Grace had given me. The stolen contract. Its symbols seemed sharper now, clearer, as though they had fed on the images Ellis captured. As I reached for it, I felt the air press against me. Heavy, thick, as though my own home had turned into the cabin of a sinking ship. I realized then that Ellis hadn't been exaggerating. The shadows had followed him home from the yacht, and now they had followed me. The night I lost the photographs, I told myself it was a trick of exhaustion. Maybe I'd misplaced them, maybe Ellis had slipped into my apartment, maybe I was starting to unravel just like him. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations fit. The hum in the air didn't leave. Not when I tried to sleep. Not when I walked outside. Not even when I drowned my ears in traffic noise. It was in me now. That's why I went back to the docks. Some part of me thought that returning to the source would give me clarity. That if I stood on that yacht myself, I'd be able to tell the difference between rumor and reality. But as soon as I saw its silhouette, its massive frame outlined against a cloudy sky, lights faint, the water around it unnervingly still, I knew I had been pulled back, not by choice, but by something older than my will. The dock planks groaned under my steps. The air was different out there. Colder, not with the bite of weather, but with a weight that pressed down on my chest. The yacht's deck stretched wide before me, gleaming faintly under the moonlight. It should have been silent, abandoned, but it wasn't. The hum was louder now, threaded into the air itself, vibrating through the soles of my shoes. It wasn't music in any form I understood. It was a dissonant collection of notes, clashing against each other, forming a rhythm that made my heartbeat stumble. I called out once, twice, but the sound of my voice disappeared the instant it left my lips, swallowed whole. That's when the deck itself shuddered, a low, guttural creak that rose through my body like the groan of something waking up. At the far end of the yacht, shadows thickened. They didn't just stretch, they pooled, as though the darkness itself had weight. The temperature plunged. My breath came out in white clouds, my fingers numbing in the air. And then the shadows rose, not like smoke, not like mist. They climbed with intention, coalescing into something with height, with form, with hunger. It was tall, impossibly tall, its hunched frame pressing against the space as if the world itself could barely contain it. Its limbs were long and sharp, ending in tapered fingers that twitched and carved invisible lines into the air. Its skin wasn't skin at all, but a surface of constant motion, blackness writhing like caged smoke. And yet, for all its shifting, it had no face, no eyes, no mouth, no expression, just a void that bore down on me with suffocating focus. I couldn't move. My body locked under the weight of it. And then, from the space between us, a desk appeared. The same desk I'd seen in Grace's story. The one Ellis had caught in his photograph. Old wood, scratched and gouged with age, its surface alive with faint glimmers of symbols etched deep into its grain. On top of it was a sheet of paper, blank, except for a sigil at the top that seemed to breathe. It pulsed like a heartbeat, twisting every time my eyes tried to fix on it. Beside it, a pen rested, glinting in the dim light, its tip sharp enough to split skin. My hand twitched. Not my choice. Not my will. Something inside me leaned forward, desperate to reach. The creature tilted its head, its void pressing harder into me. And that's when I heard it. Not with my ears, but inside my chest, my skull, my bones. A single word. Sign. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't whispered. It simply existed, as if the word had always been in the air and I had only just learned to hear it. I stammered, my voice foreign to my own ears. I don't understand. The deck groaned beneath my feet, wood splintering like laughter. The word came again, sharper this time, reverberating through my ribs. I looked down at the paper. My fingers twitched again, rising toward the pen. I pulled back with all the force I had left, my throat tearing as I shouted, "No!" The yacht groaned louder, the music swelling into a crescendo that drilled into my skull. The shadows pulsed in rage, their edges slicing through the air like blades. My knees buckled, my body convulsing under the pressure of something ancient and relentless. And then, silence. I opened my eyes, gasping. I was no longer on the yacht. I was in my bed, drenched in sweat, my body trembling as if I'd run for miles. A dream, I told myself. Just a dream. But when I staggered into the bathroom and wiped the condensation from the mirror, I saw it scrawled in uneven letters across the fogged glass. My towel smeared the letters away, but the weight of them clung to the air. I stumbled back, my chest aching. I wanted to believe it was just my mind unraveling, but deep down I knew. I hadn't imagined the desk, the paper, or the word. And whatever it was, that wasn't finished with me. I tried to convince myself that what happened on the yacht was nothing more than a nightmare. Stress. Suggestion. The echo of Grace's story feeding into Ellis's photographs, bleeding into my own imagination. That's what I wanted to believe. But then the word followed me into daylight. The first time it happened, I was at a coffee shop. Ordinary morning, ordinary line. The barista scribbled my name across a paper cup, slid the receipt across the counter, and smiled politely. I almost tossed it into the trash, but something made me glance down. At the bottom, where the signature line should have been, there was a single word, scrawled in black ink. Unmistakable. Sign. I froze. My coffee went cold in my hands. By the time I looked back up, the barista was already serving the next customer, oblivious. When I asked if she had written the word, she frowned, confused, shaking her head. "Just your name," she said. But the paper burned in my pocket all day. The word etched deep into the fibers. Later that afternoon, it appeared again. This time at a gas station. I filled my car, trying to drown the lingering hum in the static of the radio. The digital numbers on the pump flickered, and for a moment, I thought it was just faulty wiring. But then the screen locked, the digits rearranging themselves into the same word. Sign, sign, sign. It repeated over and over, the letters jittering across the display until I ripped the nozzle free and sped away. It didn't stop there. At the grocery store, a woman brushed past me, muttering under her breath. I thought she was talking to herself until I caught the word. Quiet, steady, unmistakable. A sign on the subway. A man across from me stared blankly at the floor, his lips moving silently. I leaned closer, and though no sound came out, I could read the shape of his mouth. Sign. It was everywhere. In the headlines of old magazines at the newsstand, the letters rearranging themselves when I blinked. In the notifications on my phone, where missed calls turned into messages that simply read the same single word. Even in my dreams, where strangers with hollow eyes passed scraps of paper into my hands, each marked with the word in looping, jagged script. The music grew louder too. No longer faint, no longer a whisper hidden beneath the noise. It was in every space, blaring through car speakers, humming from the vents in my office, dripping from the silence of my home. It wasn't music anymore, not really. It was pressure, vibration, a rhythm that bent thought and breath. I started losing track of time. Hours slipped past without memory. I'd look at the clock and swear only minutes had gone by. My hands shook when I tried to write. My reflection in the mirror didn't quite move with me, as though it lagged by a fraction of a second. Every sign I ignored, every refusal I gave, seemed to tighten the presence around me. The worst came one morning at a stoplight. I sat waiting, exhausted, clutching the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles burned white. In the mirror, I saw the car behind me. A little girl sat in the back seat, her face pale, her braids neat, her expression empty. She lifted a piece of paper and pressed it against the window. On it, written in bold black letters, was the word. She tilted her head slowly, unblinking, staring through me. The car horn blared behind me, snapping me back. The light had turned green. I pressed the accelerator, but her face, her gaze stayed burned into my mind. It was no longer a suggestion. It was an order, and every refusal felt like pulling against a tide too strong to resist. Tom Cruise has always been the face of control. Perfect posture, unwavering smile, eyes that lock onto you like he's reading a script only he can see. But behind that perfection, People whispered about a change, a moment where the man and the brand separated, and something else took his place. The stories were scattered, often dismissed as the gossip of former staffers or the bitterness of ex-members. But when I started collecting them, the same patterns emerged. The first came from a bodyguard who worked with him in the early 1990s, back when Cruz was already Hollywood royalty, but not yet the full symbol of Scientology's power. The guard said he attended a retreat in the desert, a private event closed to outsiders where Cruz disappeared into a small building for 3 days. No press, no cameras, no visitors. When he emerged, the guard swore his voice was different. Not louder, not softer, just sharper, edged with a conviction that hadn't been there before. It was like he came out memorized, the guard muttered, like someone had written inside his head. Another account came from a former Sea Org member. She claimed she once handled documents that weren't meant for her eyes. Stacks of pledges, confidentiality agreements, contracts that stretched lifetimes. Most were written in tight legal jargon, but one stood out. It wasn't typed, wasn't printed. It was written by hand in jagged loops, the letters curling back on themselves like snakes. At the top was his name. Not typed, not signed, but etched in a dark streak she couldn't mistake. She said she dropped the folder the second she realized what it was written with, and when she tried to pick it back up, the page was gone. Others noticed the change too. A director once confided, half joking, half nervous, that Cruz didn't need direction anymore. "You tell him the scene," he said, "and he already knows the line you were about to give him. Like, he's hearing it before you say it." Castmates whispered about the same thing, that he'd show up on set, vibrant, almost glowing, then sink into silence as soon as the camera stopped. He would stare into mirrors between takes, not checking his appearance, but like he was listening to something speaking from the other side. Even in interviews, the cracks showed. Bursts of laughter that went on too long. Smiles that didn't fade when the question ended. Answers that sounded less like thoughts and more like rehearsed sermons. He carried an energy too big for one man. An intensity that burned behind every word. Some saw it as charisma. Others saw it as possession. I kept thinking about Grace's words. They don't need your signature, just your surrender. Maybe that's what happened to him. Maybe he had stepped into that room, faced that desk, heard that same word vibrating through his bones. And maybe, unlike Grace or Ellis or even me, he hadn't fought it. Maybe he had given in. The more I read, the more I couldn't shake the idea that Cruz wasn't just a member of Scientology. He was their proof. Proof that the contract worked, that surrender wasn't death but transformation. He embodied it. Energy without limit. Conviction without doubt. A man who seemed less human and more like a vessel carrying something bigger than himself. And if that was true, then the question wasn't whether he had signed. The question was, what had signed him back? By then, the word wasn't just a whisper in my mind. It was a presence. It followed me like a shadow that didn't belong to my body. I could feel it waiting, patient, as though all of this was just a rehearsal leading me toward the same desk Grace had described, the same paper Ellis had captured, the same page that carried Tom Cruise's name in a way no ordinary contract ever should. I kept thinking about what Grace had left me, the crumpled sheet she smuggled from the yacht. I had tried locking it away, burying it under files, even considering burning it. But every time I pulled it out, the symbols were sharper, clearer. They weren't just ink. They pulsed faintly when I touched them, like veins under skin. And at the bottom, the streak. Dry, dark, unyielding. It wasn't ink at all. I didn't need a lab to confirm it. My gut already knew. Blood. That was what every story had in common. The guests at the yacht pricking their fingers. Grace's testimony of names signed in red. The Sea Org member who swore she dropped Cruz's page because she realized what it was written with. Blood wasn't symbolic. It was binding. It wasn't about words or promises. It was about essence. To sign with blood wasn't to agree. It was to give. And once it was given, you couldn't take it back. The horror wasn't just what was written on the page. It was what wasn't written. Blank space that seemed to wait, almost hungry, as if it could drink whatever you placed on it. When I stared too long at Grace's stolen sheet, I felt it tugging at me, drawing a heat from my fingertip, coaxing me to add my own mark. My hand shook every time, the pen on my desk twitching toward me like a magnet pulling iron. I began to dream of it nightly. The desk would appear, scarred and waiting. The paper lay in the center, alive, the symbols crawling like insects in the corner of my vision. And always the pen gleamed. I could feel the sharpness of its tip even without touching it. Each time I resisted, the dream shifted darker, the room colder, the hum louder, the shadows pressing closer, until one night, I finally reached out. My finger brushed the pen, and I woke with a cut along the side of my hand. That was the moment I realized something terrifying. I didn't have to sign to be marked. Contact was enough. The contract wasn't paper. It was a living thing. And once it touched you, it carried you with it. I thought about Cruz again. How he had been described as untouchable, unstoppable, glowing with energy no man should carry. Maybe he hadn't resisted. Maybe he hadn't fought the pull of the pen. Maybe he had given his blood freely. And if that was true, then he wasn't bound by a legal contract. He was bound by something deeper, something that lived in those sigils and spread through the hum. Every time I stared at that page, I wondered if what haunted me now was the same force that had remade him. And the worst part wasn't the dread of giving in. The worst part was that part of me already wanted to. Sleep was no longer a refuge. Every night, the same rhythm bled into my dreams. The hum, the desk, the pen. Even when I fought it, even when I clawed myself awake, the words still clung to the air around me. Sign It followed me into the daylight, riding the silence between car horns, weaving through the murmur of crowds. It began small, mirrors that didn't quite reflect me, my own face lagging a fraction of a second as though it were listening to something behind the glass before deciding how to move. Voices that weren't mine slipping under my breath when I was too tired to fight them. I'd catch myself whispering words I didn't remember learning, symbols curling in my handwriting when all I meant to write was a note or a grocery list. Then a spread. Strangers on the street staring too long, lips shaping the same single word. Sign. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then one leaned close as I passed, eyes vacant, and whispered it directly into my ear. The sound was so sharp, so intimate I spun around, but he was already gone, swallowed into the crowd. I stopped trusting my phone. Notifications appeared and disappeared without sound. Texts from numbers I didn't recognize, all of them carrying the same message. Sign. One night, I opened my email and found a scanned document waiting for me. It was the contract. Not Grace's crumpled sheet, not Ellis's blurred photo, but something new, fresh. My name already printed at the top. The only blank space was at the bottom, waiting. I slammed the laptop shut, but the damage was done. When I looked up, the word had etched itself across the condensation on my window again. I didn't touch it this time. I just stood there and watched as the letters slowly dripped downward like fresh ink bleeding into paper. I began to understand what Ellis meant about the shadows. They didn't just gather in corners anymore. They stretched along the walls, bending angles that shouldn't bend, swallowing light that should have stayed. At night, I'd see them move when I shifted my eyes, stretching toward me, pausing only when I turned to face them. My apartment became unlivable. Every surface felt contaminated, every silence crowded. And the music, by then it wasn't background noise. It was dominant. It threaded through my bones, shook my teeth, rattled the air in my lungs. I couldn't drown it out because it wasn't outside anymore. It was in me. Every heartbeat matched its rhythm. Every breath carried its vibration. The worst came in moments of weakness, when I caught myself wanting it to stop. Because in those moments, I heard something else beneath the hum. A promise. Not spoken in words, not written in ink, but carved directly into thought. If you sign, it ends. That was the breaking point. Because I knew as much as I feared the word, as much as I fought it, part of me wanted the silence, and wanting it meant I was already losing. When you start digging into stories like this, you realize how many so-called breakdowns never add up. They get written off as drugs, stress, fame, burnout. But when you look closer, you see the same rhythm beating beneath each one, the same hidden structure. It isn't collapse, it's punishment. And it happens to anyone who refuses. Vanilla Ice was one of the first names that stood out to me. The world remembers him for Ice Ice Baby, for the rise and the crash. But what most people don't know is that his crash didn't come from the music. It came from the invitations. A dancer who traveled with him told the story. It started in Los Angeles, an after-party on a rooftop filled with suits that didn't belong, men in expensive clothes with eyes that never blinked. Ice leaned over to his friend and whispered that he felt like prey at his own celebration. That night, he got his first number. A man in sunglasses at midnight invited him to something private. He declined, politely, casually. But decline was enough. From then on, the shadows circled. The second time, it was more direct. Madonna herself walked into his suite unannounced. She wasn't flirtatious. She wasn't playful. She leaned in and whispered an offer of marriage, not public, not romantic, but binding. He laughed nervously, said he was too young. Her reply was simple, chilling. No one's ever ready. That's the point. When she left, he told his dancer that she hadn't been asking for love. She'd been asking for surrender. He said no again, and the walls around him began to close. Equipment caught fire. His driver quit, muttering about dead men. The pressure grew heavier. The third invitation came through Diddy's Circle, a private event. The house in Coral Gables was draped in black, quiet, with guards at the back room like it held a vault. Diddy himself pulled Ice aside, spoke low, persuasive. Then one of the guards approached and said, "It's time." Ice froze. He didn't step inside. He walked out. And from that moment, the refusal marked him. Shows canceled, promoters vanished, venues rebooked without explanation. His own body revolted, nosebleeds at midnight, sickness in his stomach. The last came with Suga night. Everyone knows the balcony story. The night Suga held ice over the edge of a hotel, threatening to drop him if he didn't comply. What they don't know is that something else was on that balcony. A presence, tall, faceless, whispering the same word I've heard every night since. Sign Suge was demanding payment. The thing behind him was demanding surrender. Ice screamed, "No," one final time, and somehow he lived to walk away. That dancer said, Ice told him later, "They don't need the signature. They just want you to stop fighting." That's when it hit me. The ritual doesn't depend on the page. The page is bait. The real moment is when you stop resisting, when you let go, when you agree to silence, when you nod your head without realizing. That's the signature. And I realized something else, something even darker. Some celebrities didn't refuse. Some gave in. That's why they shine with unnatural conviction, why they look untouchable, why their eyes burn like they know something we don't. Because they've already surrendered. They've already signed. Maybe in blood, maybe in silence, maybe in the very air they breathed when the word finally broke them. Tom Cruise wasn't just an actor who rose higher than anyone else. He was the one who proved what happened when you said yes. By the time I reached the 10th night without sleep, my apartment no longer felt like mine. The walls hummed. The air vibrated. Every shadow stretched too far, bending into corners that didn't exist the day before. The word wasn't whispered anymore. It was everywhere, layered over itself 1,000 times, booming and hushed all at once. And sign. The mirrors were the first to crack. Not shatter. Crack. Thin lines spiderwebbing across the surface without sound, without force. I'd stare into the reflection, watching my own face distort until it wasn't mine anymore. Sometimes it smiled when I didn't. Sometimes it mouthed words I never spoke, and always behind it, the faint outline of a desk, waiting. One night, I woke to find the desk wasn't in my dreams anymore. It was in the center of my living room. The same scarred wood, the same symbols etched into its surface, the same paper breathing faintly like it had lungs of its own. The pen gleamed in the low light, its point sharp enough to split bone. I didn't move. My chest locked, my lungs barely pulling air. The contract was blank, but not empty. It pulsed with expectation, as if the page already knew what my name looked like. The blood would only be a formality. The shadows thickened around the walls, not creeping this time, but standing tall and deliberate. They weren't waiting for me to approach. They were closing in, herding me like cattle toward the desk. The hum in the air became a roar. Yet somehow beneath it, I heard the same single word. Deep, patient, inevitable. Sign, I shouted, "No!" But my voice cracked like glass, swallowed by the rhythm pressing into my skull. My legs buckled and I collapsed to the floor, my palms burning as though the wood beneath me were hot. The pen scraped faintly across the desk on its own, moving just enough to glint at me. For the first time, I felt what Grace must have felt when she stole her page. It wasn't choice, it wasn't will, it was pull. The contract wasn't asking me to write, it was reaching for me. And for one terrifying second, I wanted to give in. Because the silence it promised felt heavier than the torment. The word came again, slower this time, curling through my ears like smoke. Sign, I thought of Ellis, broken in his apartment, photos disappearing as shadows consumed him. I thought of Grace, trembling as the music followed her into every dream. I thought of Ice, held over that balcony, saved only by his final scream of refusal. And I thought of Tom Cruise, stepping into a room decades ago and walking out shining, smiling, bound. The shadows pressed closer, the desk pulsing with hunger. The pen trembled, begging for my hand. My blood surged hot in my fingertips, drawn forward by something older than choice. I knew then this wasn't a negotiation. It never had been. It was the last step, the final offer. Not for money, not for fame, for me. And as the word struck through me one last time, vibrating so loud it felt like my skull would split, I understood what they all had meant. The page didn't want ink. It didn't even need my blood. What it wanted was the thing I had been fighting to keep since the first whisper. My surrender. The room was no longer a room. It had folded in on itself, shrinking, pulsing with the hum that had been chasing me for weeks. The walls bent like fabric caught in the wind, the corners swelling with shadow figures that leaned forward without moving. I was on the floor, staring at that desk, at that paper, at the pen that glowed as though it carried fire at its tip. Every part of me screamed to resist, but there was another part now, small, treacherous, that longed for the silence the page promised. The music inside my chest had become unbearable, hammering against my ribs, shaking my teeth, drilling into the back of my skull. And yet, beneath the chaos, the same single word remained, deep and steady. Sign. I crawled backward, but the room stretched wrong. The floor beneath me seemed to slide, pulling me closer instead of farther. My palms burned with the heat of the wood, my lungs fighting for air as if the contract itself was leaching oxygen from the room. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I saw my own name already etched at the bottom of the page, dark and permanent. The shadows pressed tighter. I could feel them brush against me, cold fingers tracing across my shoulders, my neck urging me forward. My reflection in the cracked mirror across the room stared back, but it wasn't me. Its lips moved silently, and though I couldn't hear the words, I knew what it was saying. The same word they had all been saying. Sign. My hand twitched, rising despite every ounce of strength left in me. The pen rattled on the desk, eager like a predator sensing blood in the water. My fingers stretched toward it, the heat building, the roar in my head deafening. But then something shifted. Not in the room, inside me. A memory surfaced, uninvited but sharp. Grace, her eyes brimming with fear, whispering that the signatures weren't the point. Ellis, muttering that the shadows weren't after paper, but after people. Ice, gasping on that balcony, realizing that all they wanted was for him to stop fighting. And Tom Cruise, smiling too brightly, too fixed, too surrendered. I understood. The contract wasn't a choice. It never had been. It was pressure disguised as agreement, inevitability masked as decision. The pen, the paper, the blood, all theater. What they wanted was the moment I gave up. The instant I let go of the struggle, the crack, where my will collapsed into silence. I froze, my hand trembling inches above the desk. My body screamed to end it, to give in, to sign, and finally quiet the noise. But my voice broke through, raw and jagged. No! The word scraped out of me, torn from my throat like glass. The shadows recoiled slightly, their edges rippling with agitation. The music spiked, Louder, so loud I thought it would burst my eardrums. But I shouted again, louder this time, pushing it through the roar. No! The pen clattered to the floor. The page pulsed violently, its symbols writhing, twisting faster, more frantic, as though starving. The shadows surged, screaming without mouths, clawing the air. The mirror across the room shattered, fragments raining down like black glass. And then, silence. The desk was gone. The shadows collapsed back into corners. The hum receded like a tide pulling back into the ocean. I was alone, sprawled on the floor, my chest heaving, sweat pouring down my face. My ears rang in the absence, but the word no longer pressed against me. I had refused. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the weight lift. But the silence didn't comfort me. It terrified me. Because silence in their world wasn't victory. It was retreat. And retreat meant they weren't finished. They were waiting. Waiting for the next moment of weakness. Waiting for the next person willing to surrender.